All right, welcome everybody. As we're getting started, go ahead and yell out in the comments wherever you're watching from. If you're on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and let me know where you are watching from this evening, where you're checking in with us. And let me go. I realized that I am listening to myself in an echo on YouTube, so I am going to get rid of that. All right. Uber curious. Hello from YouTube. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and jump in. Again, as you join us, I would love to hear where you're from, where you're watching from tonight. I'm excited about this live stream. We'll give a few minutes for people to join the live stream this evening as they come in. I'm excited to talk about specifically education. Education was the last 2 weeks. We're going to talk about work. We're going to talk about agility and the ability to pivot and to basically survive through crisis, through times of difficulty. Obviously, we're experiencing a global change or a global transition here. So this will be a really once in 100 years opportunity and hopefully once in 100 years conversation today. And so, hey there, Hamza, it's good to see you on. As you are coming in, please go ahead and like these in the comments, yell out where you're from or where you're watching from, if you're on Facebook, YouTube, wherever you are. Love to connect. And as we go through the conversation this evening, please feel free to drop your comments or questions in our chat here. So and I found that I was muted. I'm sorry. Let me try that again. Dr. Jennifer Gresham, I jumped from one. I brought you on, and I was yakking away, and suddenly went silent. So her work is, your audio just went dead. Thanks, y'all. When I jumped to a new setting, it had me muted. So it wasn't important. The most important thing is my guest today. Dr. Gresham is the founder of Work for Humanity, an organization really seeking to answer the question, how can we adapt? How can we change? How can we become agile as organizations, as individuals in uncertain times? So, Dr. Gresham, thanks so much for joining us on the live stream this evening. I'd love for you to take just a few minutes and talk about your background, how you got into this work, and why you think this is so vital for the future of work.
Yeah, first, thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to get to do this with you. So my background is I was in the military for 16 years, active duty, 4 as a reservist. My education is as a scientist, so I'm a biochemist by training. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting, I didn't appreciate it at the time, but, the military asked you to change jobs every 3 to 4 years. So you're constantly doing something different. So even though I'm trained as a biochemist, I've done everything from nuclear treaty monitoring to teaching, freshman chemistry. I ran programs in space lubricants and fuel cells. I did corporate communications, and then finally was working in human performance augmentation. And every time, I would get into a new job, I'm like, I don't know anything about this. I'm completely unqualified to do this work. And I very quickly had to teach myself what I needed to know, assemble mentors, people who could support my growth. And right about the time that I thought, yeah, I've got this, right, I'd leave and I'd do it all over again. And so, like I said, during that time frame, I did not fully appreciate it. Every time was hard. Every time was scary. And it wasn't until I left the military. I ended up kind of falling into becoming a career and business coach. And, I noticed how other people were struggling with this. And I thought, wow, I actually had the best training I could have ever had for where I see things going, how things are changing in the world of work. And I really wanted to take that work that I was doing as a coach and sort of helping people around the world. So I worked, as you know, right? I worked with hundreds of people around the world, helping them choose new careers, perform better in the jobs that they had, make more money, enjoy their work more. How could we scale up that impact? And so initially, when I started Work for Humanity, we started with creating a vision. So, I think it's really important to start with what would we like the human experience of work to look like, and then work backwards from there. So in 2018, we held what's called a Blue Sky event where we invited a bunch of diverse experts from education and tech and business and all of that, and said, let's craft that vision. And I personally found it incredibly inspiring. And being who I am, I then said, okay, well, what do we need to do to now create that? And so that's where I found myself sort of at the end of 2018, was starting to put that program together, and then COVID happened.
Yeah, and it has changed everything for all of us. So I'm excited to kind of jump in and talk about a few of those things. One of the things that you said, or that you addressed in kind of the preface to the work that you did, and there's an overlay I've thrown up so people can see, but you said we should ask what the future holds, or sorry, we shouldn't ask what the future holds, but rather what we would like the future to be. The road ahead isn't a problem to solve, it's an invitation to create. So you've kind of talked about that a little bit, but can you talk about, like, where, based on where we are now with COVID, in my mind, it's really enhanced the urgency of this message that this is an invitation to create. And so can you talk a little bit about what you've learned, from that initial kind of discussion, and where you are now with this kind of thought?
Yeah, it's a great question. So back then in 2018, what I was noticing is there was a lot of prediction going on around how technology would play out in work, what was going to happen, what would the workplace look like. And of course, those predictions have been going on, for many years. Probably as long as there's been humans, there's been predictions. And the truth of the matter is most of those predictions are wrong. We can't really know what's going to happen, maybe in the short term, right? But even then, we all thought we knew what 2020 was going to be like, and we were all wrong. So I think we have to recognize, right? Like, the brain is not designed to enjoy uncertainty, right? From a biological perspective, when we evolved, there was that limbic system that says uncertainty is bad. And so it tries to fill in the gaps, right? It tries to tell us, okay, well, here's what's going to happen. And so therefore I know what to do. And so learning how to be okay with not knowing is an entirely new skill that I think all of us need to develop. And one way to do that is this idea of, rather than asking what does the future hold, ask what would I like the future to look like, and what role can I play in creating that future?
So then my question, kind of building on that, one of the other things then you said in the kind of you outlined your assumptions for this discussion. And one of the things that I think is really important in any discussion that matters or conversation that matters, especially in this type of really chaotic, crisis times, is the questions that we ask ourselves. Of course, this is really important on the individual level in personal development. It's, what are the outcomes I want, and what are the right questions that are going to guide me. As you said, the human brain isn't designed to deal with uncertainty. We don't like that, but then we also need it to thrive in some. We need a certain level of uncertainty, and so the question that I thought was really profound is, how can we leverage technology to help people perform more valuable and meaningful work in a dynamic, unpredictable future? So when you boil down all these kind of assumptions that you had laid out with all these experts that were really thinking about how to handle change, essentially, that was kind of what you boiled down, the kind of defining question of your discussion. So from that question, how did the discussion unfold, or how do you think that question should be answered today? What is the importance of that question today?
Yeah. So first, I'll just point out this report that we are referencing is the Blue Sky Report for Work for Humanity. It's absolutely free for anyone to download. Not only can you read sort of the conclusions that we came to from that meeting, but we lay out our entire process for how we develop those conclusions so that, right, we're one group of people and we have our own culture. It was very US centric so that other groups can go out and replicate this for their cultures, for their organizations, that kind of thing. So if you go to workforhumanity.com and you just scroll down a little bit on the front page, you'll see a link that will take you to that report. But I think, coming back to your question, one of the things that we realized is that for the vast majority of people, quite frankly, work is not a pleasant experience. It's not a rewarding experience, either financially, sometimes intellectually, sometimes emotionally, right? And so, I hear a lot of people going back to this issue around uncertainty and what's going to happen, and there's a lot of this, when are we going to get back to normal? And I guess I would say, why in the world would we want to go back to normal when work was so unpleasant, right? I was just talking with somebody who does a lot of organizational work, and one of the leaders in a session that she was running closed the session by saying they call it work for a reason. Yeah, and so I think this is a moment to sort of say we have options, right? COVID has changed the rules. And what that tells us is that the rules are changeable. Things can change, but without a vision, right? We just sort of plod along with what happens to us rather than feeling like we have agency to create. And so, when I think about what do I want that future of work to look like, I want it where everyone is financially and finds their work financially and emotionally rewarding. And we can create a virtuous cycle where there's shared prosperity, trust, and well-being between workers, organizations, and communities. So it's really about finding ways to thrive together.
So talk more about that, because despite all the best minds of policy and politics and human systems, we still have dramatic inequity. We have systems that were built from the foundation of our country to kind of ensconce inequity. And so how do we move towards that virtuous cycle and that virtuous relationship between organizations and those of us that are creating these systems and interacting in these systems every day?
Yes. So that is the challenge, right? The first place that we have to start is challenging our beliefs and assumptions, right? So one of those beliefs, for example, is that as an organization, if I want to be very profitable, if I want to return big returns to my shareholders, the way I need to do that is to drive down costs. So particularly in low margin industries, there is this belief of I have to pay my workers as little as possible. I have to hire as few people as possible in order to be as profitable as possible. And that's just sort of accepted. But there is a fantastic book, which I recommend to everybody, called The Good Job Strategy, which lays out model employers who have rejected that assumption in things like grocery, wholesale, retail. And what she shows is that these model retailers actually do just the opposite. They not only pay their employees well, they not only bring respect and dignity to their work, but they invest a lot in their education and training. So that's the second piece, right? So there's challenging our beliefs and assumptions about what has to be true in our systems. And then there's also providing the education and training to people to allow them to be more agile and resilient in uncertain times. So, one of the things I was having a conversation with a senior executive at a company and was asking him, do you see your organization as being fairly agile? And he said, Yeah, I think and they happen to be doing well, right, during the COVID crisis. So it's like, yeah, I think we're really agile. And I said, how much of your organization did you involve in the decisions that needed to be made in your response to COVID? Right? How involved was everybody? And he said, well, it was really just the senior team, right? We set the strategy and they executed. And so, going back to these beliefs and assumptions, right? What I said to him then was that your organization is only as agile as the people in it. And I mean all of the people in it. And so if you aren't developing that agility throughout your organization and you aren't utilizing it, you're probably not as agile as you think. And I think we can look at it and see what's happening in the economy, and that's obvious. The blind spot is that we don't realize that it applies to us, right? So what I find is that everybody says, yes, definitely we need more agile companies, more resilient companies, just not mine.
Yeah, because mine can't.
We are obviously doing well right now, so that necessarily means we are agile and resilient.
Yeah, and it's funny because we've all been like sledgehammered into being somewhat resilient and somewhat agile and somewhat adjusting. Even those of us that work in systems or in industries that are just by necessity resistant to change, something like finance or banking, or in my case, education, those things that are slow to change have been, dramatically within a week. My campus closed down and we had to reimagine everything on the fly as educators. Some of us, we're all struggling, some better than others. And then, of course, we have some students that don't have access to the same technologies and the same, infrastructure that others do. And so there are those challenges as well. And so I think it's really, what you said really stuck out to me when you said I believe you said you're only as agile as everybody in the organization. And that, I think, is something worth kind of sitting on a little bit, because I think especially those of us in positions of leadership, it's very easy to just fall into, I've been given this responsibility, and we just go into decision mode. And I experience this in a classroom because it's structured that way. I walk in and I'm the teacher and I have to fight. I tell my students all the time, I have to consciously fight to step back from teacher mode. And when they come to me looking for solutions and solving the problem, I have to be very mindful to say, I don't know, but let's figure it out.
Well, and of course, right, this is so relevant because you and I were talking about learning agility before all of this happened and how important that is. And that, the purpose of education is not to get you to learn a bunch of things, right? And of course, it's unfortunate that that's often what we test on.
Yeah.
Right. The purpose is to make you a good learner. And there's a ton of research that shows, right, learning is a frustrating process because you have to put them in a place of uncertainty. And so, I've been going around doing a lot of talks around this concept of agility. And what I, say to people is, when we think about the future of work, what we need to be thinking about is how do we train people so that they can answer the question, what do I do when I don't know what to do?
Oh, wow.
And
yeah.
What do I do when no one knows what to do?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's agility. And so, by the way, when I say that an organization is only as agile as all of its employees, that's true at a societal level too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So when I think about what have we learned from COVID is that it is incredibly dangerous for all of us to have such a fragile system, to have so many people that are deeply in debt, who don't earn enough to meet their expenses, right? Who don't have $400, to meet an unexpected. That's not good for all of us. So I think, and I won't pretend that like I've got a whole map figured out, like, yep, right. Okay, here's the roadmap. I don't. But what I do know for sure, right, is that we have got to figure out ways so that we can all thrive together. That should be the goal.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting as you're saying this, because I'm recognizing what happens in my classroom when it's terrifying, quite honestly, if I'm just being transparent, when I made a decision and I made a commitment to be the teacher who didn't always have the answer and didn't always know. or to at least allow my students that freedom in my classroom to not always assume that I had the best way or the only way. But it's really terrifying because if nobody knows the answer, or if we're using this sandbox of my classroom with that assumption, things get really chaotic. There's sometimes fear, even though everybody knows it's a safe space. Everybody knows, nobody's losing $1 million in my entrepreneur class. Nobody's losing investment money, but it's still that uncertainty because we've been so programmed in the cases of high schoolers, they've been programmed for 12 years to be very focused and very sure. When the reality is life needs us to be unsure and comfortable with being unsure. So that's really a challenge for all of us. And I think you're right. The recognizing that all of us have to be equipped with the mental fortitude to respond. What I found, and I'm curious about your perspective on this, pivoting a little bit and bringing in the concept of creativity and innovation to this, just broad kind of buzz terms. What do you notice as a correlation between creativity and innovation when people are freed to live in chaos and live in uncertainty to an extent comfortably as much as possible? Do you think there's any connection or correlation?
Well, so what I would say is that even when you're living in uncertainty, it doesn't mean that things are completely unstructured.
Great
right?
distinction. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, one of the things that when I talk about learning how to learn, it's giving people a nominal structure. It's saying, okay, I don't know what the answer is, but I do kind of I know what to do when I don't know what to do, right? I need to spend some time getting clear on what the problem is and what those interdependencies are, right? So one really important distinction that I think helps people is understanding the difference between complicated problems and complex problems. So complicated problems are what most of us learn how to solve. So complicated problems are straightforward to define, right? You can usually break it down into its component parts and solve those components independently. There's usually some sort of algorithm or best practice that you can lean on. And when you have solved that problem, and you usually know if it's right or wrong, right? So our whole education system is designed for complicated problem solving and that's great, right? There are plenty of really hard, complicated problems that need solving. Where we do a very poor job, in my mind, is helping people grapple with complexity. So complex problems are very difficult to define. You often don't know what the root cause is. So you don't know what problem you're trying to solve. It's a collection of interrelated problems. And because of that, you really can't solve those other problems independently, which is also what we try to do, right? We take a complex problem and we say, I'm going to make this manageable. I'm going to take this piece of it. Well, that's not how a complex problem works.
Yeah.
And then you're often even unsure of if you can achieve success in what it looks like, right? So if we talked about, for example, something like world peace, that's an evolvable problem. I could have world peace for a moment, but it's fragile, right? It can dissolve at any moment. So, part of what I try to do, one is help people understand what kind of problem are we trying to solve right here? And do you have processes in place that help people attack those problems in different ways? And so that's a big thing that I talk about.
Yeah, I think I appreciate that distinction of complicated versus complex because and relating it to what I know in education, we train students how to break apart problems and solve these more and more complicated problems, but really giving them the ability to think creatively and see the intersections of problems. That's where somebody becomes what we all look for in education and try to train to is problem solvers or critical thinkers. We're trying to develop that without sometimes recognizing that the process of education and breaking apart these things for students actually helps them or prevents them from developing that skill.
Right. Most people, one, have never heard that distinction and therefore don't even know when they're faced with a complex problem, and therefore try to approach it or try to redefine it as a complicated problem so they can solve it the way they're used to solving it.
Sure.
And what that creates, right, is a ton of rework. I was just talking to somebody today. It leads to reorgs, right? I find reorgs just hilarious, right? Because they never produce the result that we think they're going to produce, and yet we keep doing them.
Yeah. It's time for a new strategic plan, a reorg chart, a new, structuring of whatever, which makes sense if we're trained that way.
Right. Exactly. Right. It's not a failure of any one individual. It's because we are not trained that way. Wow. And if you can't even do the basic, simple recognition of complicated versus complex, you're practically doomed.
So in the work you've done with people and organizations, do you see what is a tell, or are there tells where you see an organization behaving or a team behaving a certain way, or you see a person do a thing that is kind of that bell, like in the temple that rings time for prayer, that's like, oh, that's what's happening. What are those things that people can recognize when they're going towards that direction?
Well, so an easy one is, and you actually hear this more often in terms of social problems, but anytime I hear someone say, well, all you need to do is this, like if they just did this, right? So anytime you have a recurrent problem that hasn't been solved, and you think the answer is fill in the blank, right? And it's very simple and straightforward. Yeah. You've got a complex problem, and you've got someone who's trying to make it a complicated problem.
Got it.
So that's the first thing, right? If you ask me who I feel sorry for most in the entire world, it's government officials like city council members, right? Mayors. We basically ask them to solve all of the complex problems that we're facing simultaneously with no training, right? And then we tell them like, oh, clearly the answer to that is this, right? We just need more public transit, or we need to give people homes, right? So that's one thing. The other thing that organizations can really look for is the amount of rework, right? So one of the things that I think is very fascinating is that as technology has developed, right, this life of leisure has not, right? If anything, we are more overworked and overburdened than we were before. And I think this is partly because we don't really understand automation. I have a few articles on that if anybody's ever interested. So automation often doesn't do what we think it's going to do. But the other part of it is that what should be happening, right, is that automation is taking over those complicated processes that can be automated. So that frees us up to do more complex work. But if you don't know how to do complex work, then what you do is you're essentially solving the same problem over and over again. And if let me give you an example. I told you this was going to be controversial. So what's an example of an organization not handling complexity well? In my mind, the way Facebook handled the Cambridge Analytica scandal is a beautiful example of trying to take something that's really complex. Why is this happening and what can we do to prevent it from happening again? And saying, well, we just need better checkers of the identity of who's making these ads. It turned it into a technical issue. And the repercussions for that, right, were huge, right? So think about all of the churn that created in the organization, the lack of public trust, right? I mean, if you fail to recognize and adequately address complexity, it can be, frankly, catastrophic.
And specifically, it's interesting you brought up Cambridge Analytica, because last year I finished my master's degree, and it's essentially a journalism degree. So I was studying all of these mass communication issues, and that was kind of front and center. And you have Facebook as an organization responding, but you have all this pressure from society reacting looking at this as a complicated versus complex issue. Government, especially at the federal level, hauling people before Congress and all kinds of hearings and things, trying to basically, now that you say that, a lot of congressional hearings are just yelling about complex problems from a framework of a complicated yes. framework. Because it's exactly. Tell us how this is why you did this and how we're going to fix it, instead of recognizing the nuance of the challenges that we're actually facing when you look at it from a national security level, when you look at it from, election security, all these things that are intersection at this place.
Right. And frankly, I think we should have some empathy for Facebook. I don't think that they would have anticipated that happening. I don't think there was anything nefarious there. But what it highlights, right, is like, crap, is our business model incompatible with the needs of society? And given our mission, what the heck do we do about that?
Yeah.
That's a really unpleasant thought. And so I think we can have empathy for the leadership and sort of say, who knows what we would have done in that situation.
Especially when you're ultimately responsible in our current, how we've created capitalism to express itself in Western culture is in a way where you're responsible to shareholders that want to maximize profit almost at all costs, or protect profit at the very least. And so that's a really profound question that you can't just go into the boardroom and say, okay, what should we do? Because there's no right answer.
Right. I mean, I think it's interesting, right? The board members are given a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated, was it BlackRock, I think, or the Business Roundtable, right, that came out and said, look, we have to think outside of just that fiduciary responsibility. But because that fiduciary responsibility is, legal.
Yeah.
And thinking about other stakeholders is not, right? Those rules need to change.
Yeah.
And so again, I think that some of this, COVID will bring some of these issues to the forefront. I mean, one of the things I'm shocked that I'm not hearing more about is what is the legal responsibility and liability for organizations for both their employees and their customers.
Yeah.
Right? If we ask somebody to go back to work and they get sick, if we invite customers back in and they get sick, what responsibility? And I don't think we know the answer to that, right? I mean, that's the scary thing, is that we're in this very uncertain place. And the risk there is almost entirely borne by the workers and the customers.
Yes. Yeah. That's here locally. I was reading an article about a restaurateur who they're permitting some restaurants to open slowly at minimal capacity and these types of things. And this restaurateur said, I'm not doing this until we have more certainty, because I'm not willing to put my customers and my employees in that position. And it's just not worth it. Even though my business is down 60%, that additional, 60% right now is worth it. And I thought that was a really interesting way of, obviously she's making a personal decision, a business decision, and even an ethical decision. But I think, to your point, it's still, these things will play out and have to go through courts. And unfortunately, we're all trying to deal with all of these implications on all different levels in business, in all different sectors are all trying to handle it. And so that's really fascinating. I want to invite there's about 20 people watching. And those of you that are listening into our chat, I mean, I could chat all day, but I'd love to take questions. If you have questions or your organization is struggling with some of these issues of how work has changed and what this looks like through remote work, please drop those questions in, and I'm happy to bring those up. But I'd love to have those of you who are watching us jump into the conversation. So feel free to do that in the comments, and they'll pop up in front of me, and I'll try to bring those into the conversation. So as we look at this kind of larger than just one or two issues or one or two industries, how do we think about now not everybody, but many people, and this is happening around the world. I talked this morning to some people in 2 or 3 different countries in Asia as well as in Europe, and slowly societies are going back or trying to figure out what normal looks like and how do we safely move forward. What does this look like as leaders try to bring their employees, their businesses back online, their employees back into a workplace? How do we think about work? How do we think of these ideas of resiliency, especially if a leader is in a place of recognizing that there's an opportunity to do something different? What would be your advice to that person that recognizes I have an opportunity to change things or to reassess at the very least?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, one of the first things I love to do with leaders is to sort of say, look, ideally, how would you like to come out of this? What would your business look like if you could remake it? Because this is the time to remake your business. One of the things that I've been doing is I have been studying the businesses who are already thriving through this crisis, particularly in industries that have been really hard hit. So like the restaurant industry. And one of the things I think is interesting, right, is like there's a restaurant that's just a few blocks from my house. I happen to know the chef really well. He said, he got it written up in Wired, his business is 3 times greater now than it was a year ago. He's hiring through the crisis. Now, some of that, right, is that he was incredibly innovative and agile before the crisis hit. So this was a guy who his menu changed every day. Like you will never have the same exact dish outside of maybe 1 or 2 dishes when you go in there. But he would have theme nights. And so, now he's actually, one of the things he's really known for is experiences, creating really, every time you would go in there, he'd bring out a blowtorch, right? And he'd use it in some interesting way. So he asked himself, how can I create dining experiences in a takeaway delivery kind of way? That's a very interesting question. What a fun thing to contemplate, right? Yeah. So he's really experimenting with this. So I noticed, last week he had a camping experience, and part of what you could purchase was a tent, right? And all the making for s'mores and a little, gas thing. Anyway, it was just really creative. The whole thing cost like $235. That's more than you would have spent probably if you'd gone to the restaurant. So it's not surprising that he's doing so well. There was another example of a flower seller. So here in Seattle, Pike Market is one of the big tourist attractions, right? It's like a really large farmer's market. And one of the famous parts of that are the flower sellers. We have beautiful flower farms here. So what do you do when the market gets shut down? Yeah. Right? And you've got fresh flowers. You can't keep your product until the economy opens back up. Well, what one of those sellers ended up doing was recruiting their big fan base to sell the flowers for them. So their customers actually became wholesalers. And so they got customers to do a bulk order, purchase those, and then resell them through social media with a tip included for themselves. So the customers won because they were actually making money now. And here is this flower seller. They're selling out every week.
And it's fascinating because they've incentivized speaking of off camera, before this started, we were talking about work as human resource commoditized. And here's all this human resource sitting at home, some people are bored, or can't work from home or whatever the issue is, but can, jump on and, sit on Facebook and sell flowers. And that's really, really creative, especially in an industry where like there's the implication or the impact of tourism, like people aren't coming to the community like they were. My brother just moved to the Seattle area and he's like, the first few weeks I was here, traffic was terrible. And he's like, now I can get around. So everything has changed. And so you're impacted by tourism, but also if you have a product like that, that's quick to, has a short shelf life, literally, you have to think quickly. Can
then how do entrepreneurs or how do business leaders train themselves to think that way, or how can they deal when they're put in an uncertain situation and they recognize, oh, these are very complex issues. I have tourism and I have the product that's going bad and all of this. How can they bolster their business?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. One, which we already touched on, which is engage your entire team. So oftentimes, right, we tend not to reach out to those frontline customer-facing employees. We think they're just there to do the job. But you know what? They know the customer better than anyone.
Yeah.
So engaging your entire team in how can we be more innovative and creative here? What are you hearing? What did you hear before that now you think, hey, what if we did this?
Yeah.
So, talking about this as an opportunity, right? This is an opportunity to do some learning and growing as a team in things like being more creative and being more innovative that you may not have had time to do before when you were busy just executing on what you knew worked.
Right.
So what a great opportunity to do that. I think the other piece is to run experiments. So you're not going to know what's going to work, right? That restaurateur had no idea if this camping experience would be a hit or not a hit, which is why he's changing it up all the time. So this is where, I think the technologists, right, and the big data people would say, gather data, and do a lot of experimentation, but you have to learn from that experimentation. So that also involves making sure that you're asking lots of questions. This is a beautiful time to practice question making.
And I think that's a skill that many people start their business doing, and then as business becomes successful, we run on track record versus the changing in the economy or the market and all of these other things. I want to pull. Pam asked a question. Pam Dibbs says, I notice many organizations see employee training and development budgets as non-essential expenditures right now. What are your thoughts?
It's it's unfortunate, right? When things get scary, we tend to shut down and we think, okay, we need to go into austerity mode. But really, this is the time to invest, right? We all talk about that, buy low, sell high, but it's hard, right? From a psychological standpoint, it's actually hard to do that. We know that. This is the time that you need to be investing in your team and your development and your growth, because if you don't, you're unlikely to come out of this as a healthy organization. Let's just say that. So, I think part of what's happened is that, we've just been through the longest economic expansion in history. And so I think that lulled a lot of business leaders into kind of a sense of false comfort, right? I know what I'm doing. I don't need to ask questions, right? We've got a system down and it works. But, quite frankly, being able to make money in a growing economy maybe doesn't mean what you think it means. And so, this is an opportunity to grow, I think, both individually and together, so that we're better and stronger. And that's a real opportunity. And like I said, we have those examples of companies who are doing it. And so I think another big piece there is to get out of that thinking that says, well, I can't do that because my industry is totally impacted.
Yeah.
But there's almost surely an example in your industry of people who are doing just that. And frankly, if you don't find a way to do it, they're likely to take your market share.
Yes, that's a great point. And I think it's kind of a cliche in kind of self-help and personal development world that the like our development of whatever it is we're doing, if someone else has done that, if there's anybody in the world that has done what you want to do or achieved what you want to achieve, it's possible. But in business or in life in general, the tendency is, well, I can't because, and there's all the reasons that we've just assumed or justified to ourselves that we can't do, instead of keeping that kind of growth mindset open and saying, let me test it. Let me at least try before I completely shut it down. Let me gather some additional data. So I think that's really important. One question that came up here, Matthew asks, how can companies make their talent development strategies part of their plan to become more agile?
That's a good question. I mean, frankly, I don't know how you get out of this without doing talent development. I mean, like I said, there are wonderful case studies. And if you look at the case studies, if we go back to the Great Recession, many of the companies who grew through the Great Recession, and there were some, they were all companies who were developing their talent, right? So they saw their talent development as the means to grow from this disruption.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really key point that I think a lot of people don't understand. It goes back to the idea that you're only as agile and innovative as all of your organization. And so, this is an opportunity to launch new products and services, to grab talent from locations and with backgrounds that you maybe otherwise couldn't have. I talked to a senior executive talent recruiter yesterday. And he said that one of the most key things that's going to happen right now for companies who are really thinking ahead is they're going to be hiring right now. They're going to be scooping up talent who's been laid off from other organizations because they would never be able to get them otherwise.
Yeah.
Right. So thinking about this as buy low, sell high, this is the time to invest.
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting. When you said that, I was like, the reason this live stream is happening every week is because professionals have a little more breadth of schedule in the evening. Somebody can sit down for an hour, where if we were all running around, there's family things and all the stuff we fill our lives with, where, I was like, I bet I could have some really interesting conversations with interesting people. And it's been easy to reach out to people, a week out and say, hey, can you do this next week? And typically people are like, sure, and I normally wouldn't, you'd have to budget or, schedule maybe a month out or something or longer to get people. So that's really interesting that I never thought of that. But like, if I had a business, it'd be like, who can I hire? How can I scoop up
into my team now that never would have been accessible to me? And I think, the other piece is that even if for some reason you can't do business right now, you need to be preparing for when you can.
Yeah.
And it's undoubtedly isn't going to be the same world that we all came into, and we don't know what that looks like. So you need to start doing that work now, or you'll find yourself unprepared.
Yeah, and it goes back to the original work that you all did in the Blue Sky report. Is we have to you didn't say this implicitly, but I think it's all through that. If we don't choose actively to imagine what it could be, especially now more relevant in this time of crisis, it's going to unfold in many unexpected ways if we're not strategic. And if those who are planning and those who are imagining and preparing will be the ones best positioned to respond as things change, moment by moment, probably for the next at least 2 to 5 years, just as we adjust to whatever normal looks like beyond this. Another question came up. Brent asks, he said, hi, Jennifer. Is part of the problem here how we think about the value of different industries? For example, traditional measures like percentage of GDP or combined market cap of the industry.
Well, I think we need to rethink value just across the board. There's a wonderful economist, Mariana Mazzucato, I believe I'm saying that right. And she has a whole beautiful talk on rethinking value. I mean, I think this helps us rethink value of industries, right? I mean, we've just seen the value of oil dramatically change overnight. I mean, who would have predicted that was where things were going?
Right.
We're seeing the value of frontline employees, right? All of a sudden, we have a whole industry that we now see as essential. I think it's fascinating, right, that President Trump finally used his national, emergency powers to declare that meat processing, was a national critical infrastructure.
Yeah.
We've never thought about it that way. It certainly is, right?
Yeah.
We can argue about how that all went about and what should be done there. But it is, right?
Yeah.
So I think we're starting to understand that industries and jobs and workers are far more valuable than we understood them to be. And then the question is, what do we do with that, right? Do we say I can't pay my workers more, because anybody can do that. Well, first of all, that's simply not true. And second of all, there's a lot of investment that you can put in those frontline workers that will help you be more agile, and make more money. And so I think we need to be, if we want to think about growth, right, it should be a shared growth. And that's one of the things I really hope comes out of this.
It's really interesting because you talked about looking at the market and seeing where there's examples of people or organizations doing this. But when we look historically, we can look back at basically how our current work system was established, and again, we can judge ethics and all of this in hindsight. But when you think of somebody like Henry Ford, who at the time said, I'm going to essentially overnight, I'm going to double the salary of my workers. And everybody, all the other robber barons said, no, you can't do this. You'll destroy the economy. And he did it and created essentially, maybe not all him, but this middle class that had money to spend discretionary income, which was good for business. And he sold cars, and all of those things we know historically. But it's kind of like the complicated versus complex, where we say, oh, well, it worked there in history, but it's different now. Like, I can't pay my people a living wage because then, and we don't really understand how these things are interconnected.
So it turns out this is a report that I'm still trying to finish. I've been talking about it for months, and I swear I'm just committing to you that I will actually finish it in the near future. So I've actually studied that extensively.
Really?
What are the system forces that govern the labor market? And so pre-COVID, the question was, why aren't wages rising? How can that be true in this economic expansion? That's not what we would normally predict. But I think we've forgotten, I love that you use this Henry Ford story. We've forgotten that shared prosperity is necessary for growth for all of us, right? We either rise together or fall together. And so what I think has largely happened is we were already seeing a lot of disruption and change and complexity pre-COVID. And what I think a lot of people don't understand is that organizations were already struggling to provide value and to meet those shareholder expectations. And so what happened, right, was that basically they had to create that value by cutting costs, by doing stock buybacks, right? Those kinds of things, the increasing financialization of the market. And so what that tells us is that our organizations were in trouble before COVID. And my hope is that this will really serve as a catalyst for people to fix those, what I would basically say is a lack of skills, right? This really exposes a lack of skills across society. That's as true of the workers as there's a skills gap, right? In the workers and in leadership. So one of the things I mentioned to you that we were going to do, Work for Humanity is a nonprofit. So for the month of May, because I know that there are a lot of people out there who are struggling, is to offer free consultations. So if they want to go to workforhumanity.com, there's a contact page there. If they just put in the subject line, May consultation, so it doesn't get lost in my email, then I'll get back to you and we can get that scheduled and really help people be, I think, more strategic and more innovative in how they're addressing this crisis.
I'm glad you brought that up because Andrew had asked, this is so relevant, important, and necessary. How can we get involved and bring this to our workplace and best support the work for Humanity? So definitely go to workforhumanity.com. It's right there under Dr. Gresham's name and fill out the contact form and at least begin the conversation. You won't be sorry. It will change your organization and change your outcomes. One final question. Elgin asked, has this disruption, meaning COVID, I assume, caused enough pain to get people to think collectively, understanding our economy is more of a spider web than a silo? I like that analogy, spider web versus a silo.
It's hard to know. I find, unfortunately, that our thinking tends to be rigid, right? I think it's hard to know yet, has the crisis been bad enough to shake our assumptions. There's a wonderful concept called post-traumatic growth versus post-traumatic stress. So most people have heard of post-traumatic stress, but there is something called post-traumatic growth. And post-traumatic growth happens where you come through some sort of disruption, you reflect on that in a way that makes you better and stronger than you were prior. And almost all of us have probably had an experience like this in our lifetime, right? Mm-hmm. Where something happened. I was talking to somebody who was dyslexic, right? Mm-hmm. No one would want to be dyslexic in our education system. It's really difficult for kids. Yeah. But for kids who find their way through that, right, who find a way to work around the system, wow, right? It gives them a set of skills that makes them unstoppable, which is why there are so many dyslexic CEOs, actually. So we all have something in our past that we've been through that was very difficult. We wouldn't want to repeat it, but we came out of it stronger and better than we were before. And when you look at that research, the key to making that switch from post-traumatic distress versus post-traumatic growth, there's actually a number of factors that influence it. But the key one is, did it change your assumptions about the world? Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah. Wow.
Right? So I don't know, right? And surely for some people, right, we've gotten to that level of disruption that we have shaken their assumptions. And in that moment, if we provide each other with the right support, I think we can push organizations and individuals into post-traumatic growth. And for some people, unfortunately, it may require more disruption. And hey, good news, it's coming.
Yeah, exactly. That's really fascinating because I was unaware of the phenomenon. Periodically, when I look off screen, I'm like jotting notes furiously. That I really want to look into that because I think there's an opportunity for those who are aware that this process is happening. I can choose to be traumatized. And I think I had this experience when our campus closed down. The first 2 weeks, it's like I was in I think probably just a minor depression. Like it was so hard to get going. It was so hard to, I was just like, I don't feel productive. I just felt, and then I was guilting myself because I'm like, I expect more of me. My employer's expecting more of me. And when the reality is we're all just trying to hold on by a thread. But there's an opportunity now for those of us who choose to be aware to say, let me look where the opportunity is for growth. Let me challenge my assumptions, challenge my, the things that I said had to be this way. And we're en masse, the entire world essentially is put in a place where we can decide huge social issues. Like, is it okay that this many people live in poverty and not just in poverty, but just within, we talk about living paycheck to paycheck, but literally we're seeing where I think it's 30 million people in the United States are unemployed right now. I think that's the figure or something. It's crazy. And when you think on local levels, I look at just in my tiny little state in Arkansas, the number of people and how it's impacting our economy. But we get this opportunity to ask all these questions about what we assumed about our economy going forward. So it's a great opportunity.
Right. And to make different decisions based on those shaken assumptions, right? To simply say, obviously it's not okay. My opinion, it is simply not okay to have that level of poverty. And then we're going to make different choices. We're going to make different rules. We're going to make different policies. We're going to create different opportunities. And that's where I think Work for Humanity can really help is helping people see those opportunities.
So that's perfect timing. So if your organization is looking for how to navigate these uncertain times or how to really think differently to push the envelope of what's possible, if you're looking to set your organization ahead for the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 years, go to workforhumanity.com. This is the first step to starting down that process. Be strategic, be thoughtful, and pass that information on to those of your colleagues and friends that are looking for this. This is a great time, the month of May, to take advantage of this opportunity. Of course, free of charge initial consultation to really kind of get under the trunk of what's possible. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me this evening. I knew this conversation would be so much fun and so enlightening. I'm going to have to take my notes, and then I'm probably going to have to call you personally and be like, help! I'll be filling out the contact form. But I appreciate your generosity of spirit and time tonight to share your intellect and thoughts on where we are and where we can go.
My pleasure. This was really very enjoyable. I loved it. And just a reminder to everybody, if you do write me, make sure you put in that subject line, May consultation, yes, so you don't just get lost. And obviously we will accommodate as many people as we can. I have no idea how many people are going to respond to this.
I appreciate it. Yes. Make sure you note May consultation. So you get bumped to the front of the line. Next week, I do these live streams Thursday night, 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. So Eastern, 8 p.m., and then all the way out Pacific, 5 p.m. Next week, I'll be with Sarah Catherine Gutierrez, who is the founder of Aptus Financial. She's a personal finance expert, and we're going to be talking about how to survive and thrive in a time of crisis financially. So it'll be another dynamic conversation you won't want to miss. You can go to YouTube and you can find that event already lined up and set a reminder on YouTube to rejoin that conversation next week. I want to thank all of you who have joined us this evening, everybody who's chimed in the conversation. It's been a really fun hour, and I thank you for spending it with me. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thanks, Steve.